Greetings and salutations all. I.S. Anderson here once again, and yes, as the title implies, today we're going to talk about sex in books. Now this topic actually first came up a few months ago. It was brought up by Ariel Bissett, and I'll leave a link to her video to it below if you want to check that out. I've been recently watching a whole bunch of people's different responses to the videos, and from what I can tell, it seems as though a lot of people are, for the most part, seem to be pretty much accepting of the idea of sex in books for the most part. Specifically, the topic was sex in YA books, which means sex in books where characters are between the ages of like 14, 15, 16, maybe 17, but not quite 18. Now, as far as YA goes, young adult literature, I think for the most part we should try to steer clear of sex between those types of characters. Yes, in the real world, teenagers do have sex, and they are kind of at that age where they start exploring such things. But I think for the most part it's good to keep that out of the books as much as possible. Sometimes it's kind of necessary. Like a good example would be The Fault in Their Stars. I mean, two cancer patients, they start dating, falling in love. Of course, eventually they're going to have sex because it's just like, we're going to die soon anyway. So, and also, sometimes the characters get married, so I guess, yes, they would have sex. I certainly don't think it needs to be explicit like it is in, erotica fiction. But in a nutshell, I would say you can have sex in YA, but use it sparingly and use great caution when you do it. Now, having said that, I don't agree with a lot of people's aversion to it, and or at least their reasons for the aversion to it. Namely, this idea of if teenagers read about, characters their age doing this in the books, then that means they're going to be encouraged to do it themselves. Yeah, like that's what's going to encourage them. I mean, as far as I could tell, the kids that tend to read more tend to be less likely to get into trouble like that. So, yeah, I really don't think this, keeping the sex out of the YA books is going to keep the sex out of the real life. I really just don't see that happening. Now, there is the mindset of people who think, sex should be saved until you're married. You shouldn't be doing that, and, young teenagers tend to not be married, so therefore they shouldn't be doing that. The thing you got to keep in mind about, no sex before marriage is when that rule was made up, people were getting married really young. I mean, a lot younger, like 12, 13, 14, 15 tops. So expecting people to wait until then, to have sex, was a much more reasonable expectation. Nowadays, people are putting off marriage until their mid to late 20s or oftentimes even their 30s. You really can't expect people to not get busy until then. Now, to be fair, I will counter one of the pro-sex and YA book arguments. A lot of people like to say how, well, sex is a natural part of life, it's a natural part of the human experience, an expression of affection and all that stuff, and it's natural, and why should we ignore it? And I totally agree with that. And the same could be said for urination, defecation, vomiting, but we don't like to read about any of that stuff, do we? No. And the reason why we don't like to read any about that stuff is because it does not titillate us. We like sex in books for the reason of titillation, whether through be emotion or a little bit more physiological, but it's for titillation, and let's not kid ourselves about that. Now, as far as older stories go, well, that being stories with characters of 18 plus, usually in their 20s or 30s, 40s, or even older, I think if you're going to write a story like that, you should be allowed to put in whatever type of sex you want, as much of it as you want. Just if it is, explicit, make sure you have some sort of warning in the description. But other than that, writers should feel free to do whatever it is they want. For those of you who watch my Not Safe for Work video, you do know that on occasion I do read some erotica fiction, and some of it can get downright nasty and raunchy. And yes, I've read a few BDSM stories. They tend to read the same after a while, but yes, I do read that level, and I've read some, safer stuff too. I'm just trying to demonstrate that, yes, I do approve of sex in books, and whoever wants to read, nastier stuff, the better, that's completely fine with me. And on the other end, if you're one of these people that likes to run for the hills anytime someone mentions the sex word, that's fine. There's plenty of stuff out there for you to read also. One interesting point that Brie Fauché brought up in her video about this, I'll link to her too. One thing that she brought up was, our society's acceptance of violence in books and how violent they get. She used The Hunger Games as an example, even when it comes to YA books, and yet, everybody's so squeamish about sex in books. As an author, I know exactly what she's talking about. I experienced it firsthand. I mean, people have come up to me and said, well, should I let my 11-year-old son or my 12-year-old son read your books? And I say, well, I mean, it might not be exactly appropriate for them. There is a lot of violence in it. There's people, that get killed all the time. And they're just like, whatever, let me have it and all that stuff.
If I put in my books people getting nearly bitten in half, or limbs hacked off, or getting shot in the head, or, cut in half, nobody bats an eye because it's all part of the plan. But as soon as one woman has sex with her boyfriend, everybody loses their friggin' minds.
Okay, bad Heath Ledger impersonations aside, the point I'm trying to make is, I have such violent things going on in my books. In the first book, people getting killed left and right. I don't write about Dudley Do-Right or rainbows and unicorns. My heroes, they snap bones, snap necks, shoot people in the face, do what have you. And nobody cared about that. Nobody said anything about that. Yeah, go ahead, let our kids read this and all that stuff. But then in the second book, when the characters started having sex with each other, that's when everybody lost their shit. Okay, it wasn't everybody. It was only a few people, but you get what I'm saying. Yeah, another thing Brie mentioned in her video was that how she says that men seem to be very judgmental about women reading erotica and all that stuff. I don't know, personally in my experience, the only time men seem to get judgmental about that is when women start criticizing them about, watching porn on video, and then it turns into, yeah, well, you have your porn too and all that stuff, yeah. So anyway, yeah, people seem to be judged for liking that stuff. Yeah, have you ever noticed whenever somebody speaks out against this stuff, whenever they, do an anti, sex and books things, they always preface it by, no, I'm not a prude or anything. I think, yeah, sex is great and all that stuff. It's like people are afraid to have a stance on sexuality no matter what it is. They don't want to admit they're prudes, yet they don't want to admit that they like it. That's pretty much the definition of prudish right there. You're afraid to take a stand on sexuality no matter what it is. And you know what? People are going to judge you no matter what. If not for this, it'll be for something else. So just have your opinions and don't care what anybody else says. You can't stop them from judging you, and they can't make you give a shit. At the end of the day, though, the debate is really pointless. There's stuff out there to read that has absolutely no sex in it, and there's stuff out there that has very dark Stockholm Syndrome / rapey / very, very, very dark erotica that I might even be a little bit afraid to touch. And if you really have your heart set on reading a young adult story with some sex in it, but don't think that the traditional publishing companies are going to ever publish something like that, there's probably some independent writers out there that do it. I don't know who they are, but they're probably out there. So I hope that gave you some food for thought, or at least found that mildly entertaining. And as always, I'll leave my print and contact information down below in the abyss, and links to the videos that I mentioned before. And please comment, rate, subscribe, you know the drill. And until we see each other next time, this is I.S. Anderson telling everybody, make your lives grand and have a good day. Thank you very much.